Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about mobility. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, why do software engineering companies promote internal mobility? Well, it's usually because software developers get bored, and internal mobility means that it is more likely for you to, one part, be able to solve internal conflicts if people don't get along or so forth. But it's primarily because you can increase the lifespan potentially of how long a developer stays in the same company. Statistically, software developers, they stay for 2 to 4 years in the same company. And internal mobility, especially in larger companies, it means that if you're bored with one team or one way of working, you can move to another team, and maybe that's gonna give you a sensation of starting all over or refresh yourself or so forth and so forth. And it's a very good thing if you can achieve this. But I think that there is a subtle benefit that not that many people think about, which I think is a little bit sad, because if you achieve this, it's actually a very good thing for the company, and it is what I call the McDonald's principle. And or I don't know if it's just a term that I made up myself. Because the best thing about, well, I'm not going to say the best thing, but one of the things that have made McDonald's or these sorts of fast food industry restaurants so successful is, apart from having a decent product, which people are obviously buying. I don't, regardless of how people feel about McDonald's or Burger King or like any of the fast food industry restaurants, right? They have one thing in common, which is the consistency and convenience of their restaurants. You can go into any McDonald's and have, regardless of almost where you are in the world, and have a fairly consistent experience. And that consistency means that you, as the consumer, you know what you're getting. The reason why I make this analogy and why I think that this is so important is because internal mobility, your ability to switch between teams and move around, is very much determined by how easy will it be for you to get into a new team. How well do they structure their onboarding process? How is the code base similar, or is this a completely different project? Because internal mobility is very difficult, unless you want to pay a fairly high cost of retraining people, if you don't have any consistency between your teams. And the reason why I believe personally that consistency is so important is because code sharing, shared understanding, internal mobility as an example, and standardization of tooling and so forth, all of these things are possible if you try to follow the McDonald's principle. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has to use exactly the same libraries or things like that, but we have something which is a term we call the golden path, where the idea being that there is a accepted range of technologies a team can use within a company, because this, in larger companies, especially when you work in a distributed fashion, it's almost unsustainable to let everybody use whatever they want. This idea that you're running microservices, therefore it's a good idea for you to use very, very different languages for every service, is stupid. It's the opposite of this. The reason why it's stupid is because it actually creates a situation where it is difficult for you to hire people. It is difficult for you to move between like this internal mobility, because you have to basically retrain people, and some people don't want to work in a specific language or so forth and so forth. And in many cases you have to reinvent the same solution for multiple platforms, because maybe you want to create some company libraries or something like that to do something. Well, all of a sudden you have 7 different languages that all need to be supported. And this is actually a fairly big problem, and this is why I struggle with this in the company that it's actually one of the things that I'm trying to fix in my current company, where and this is a gigantic company where the diversity and difference in quality, because some teams you might work with, they have a really good development process, they have like high quality, they work in modern practices, they do everything in a like a fairly sustainable way, and then you have teams that are like so unproductive and so like they have they have a completely different way of doing things, which means that they affect everybody else in the ecosystem. It's once again, it's sort of like McDonald's. If McDonald's has a few restaurants that is giving this really shitty experience or very different experience, they have to step in because it affects the entire brand perspective. And that is true for most companies, and it's true in IT as well, because in IT it's even worse, because in a distributed system, as you can imagine, if you think about a distributed system as a network of nodes, as a graph, all these nodes are connecting to each other in some fashion. If you have one or two nodes, or even a cluster, or especially like for the bigger systems, if you have a big node that a lot of are connected to a lot of other nodes, that thing sets the precedence for most of the other nodes on the network. So if you have requests, depending on how you work now, if you can't work in an autonomous fashion or ship things independently, then that node basically slows everything else down, or causes, like, you always have to account for the inconsistencies. And the ideal state is to have an even distribution of the node's value within the network, and have them all be consistent and perform at about the same sort of level, because that way, as you can if you think about telecommunications, etc., it doesn't really matter if you have one relay station or something like that that is like super performant, when all the other ones that are connected to in downstream or upstream, depending on how you look at it, they don't actually work. Doesn't matter you have one really performant relay without the others, and it's the same thing in software. And that is why I am a very strong believer in trying to define a boundary and trying to work towards a more consistent team setup. Sort of like, as I said, like sort of creating a McDonald's implementation of software development teams, where they have sort of the same tech stacks. I mean, the teams, it's not like micromanaging. They can make their own choices, but there should be a range for, like, okay, these are the tools that you can pick between. These are the work processes that we try to follow. These are the rituals, etc. So you have certain expectations, SLAs or KPIs, depending on how you look at it, that are common to all the different teams, so that each team feels a little bit familiar. Because if you do that, one part is that there are fairly large technological and product development benefits to that, but the other part is that internal mobility becomes a very cheap thing for you. You can move around people quite a lot, because if they know how to work in one team, the transition to another team isn't all that great in terms of cost. So what I want you to take away from this is that the reason why companies usually promote internal mobility is, number one, because software developers get really bored and they want to create an inclusive environment where people feel accountable to each other. Because, as you can imagine, in larger companies, guys, you work very much in an isolated fashion, and mixing people and making sure that you don't create these weird political resentments and so forth, which is a very real thing. Trust me, you do not want to be in a company where one department is like their own little tribe, where they basically hate anybody who is from another department. It's literally that way. I've been in companies like that. You don't want that. So interbreeding or intermixing is actually a very good thing for you. And the main benefit is usually that software developers, in the office space, it creates a nicer, more friendly dynamic between people. It's healthy for people to mix and match a little bit, and it also means that a lot of software developers stay around longer, because they don't get bored as quickly, or they don't look for alternative companies to work in, because they can move around within their own company. Lastly, a subtle benefit that I think is very overlooked, but it's probably one of the most powerful ones, is that if you want to have good internal mobility at a low cost, you need to sort of architect your development process and your team structures and your tech stack to fit into that desire. And when you do that, I like to say, try to sort of create a McDonald's of your within your company. When that consistency and familiarity is there, the benefits are exponential. It's very worth considering, because I've seen a lot of success if you have that sort of structure. And then most of the things that I mentioned, as with internal mobility, becomes a very cheap and feasible thing. But if you don't have it, it might actually be very expensive for you. So it's worth thinking about. Have a great day.